This next lecture is the integumentary system, which is basically another word for the skin. We're going to look at the different portions of the integumentary system and the different components of the integumentary system. To start with, let's look at the two regions of the skin, the epidermis and the dermis. Epi means above, and epidermis literally means above the dermis. And so therefore the epidermis is the most superficial region of the skin, and it consists mainly of epithelial tissue. And as we know from epithelial tissue study, that's avascular. The dermis is underneath the epidermis. It's mostly a fibrous connective tissue, and it is vascular. Now, below the dermis, there's the hypodermis. Again, hypo means below or inferior to, so hypodermis would be below the dermis. And this is actually not considered a layer of skin. The skin is composed of the dermis and the epidermis. Hypodermis is just a layer of subcutaneous fat that's deep to the dermis. It anchors the underlying structures, mostly muscles. This is a diagram of the different components of the integumentary system, and I'll just point out the pertinent parts. First, I'll notice that there's two layers of skin. There's the epidermis and there's the dermis. The epidermis is this upper layer. It's basically it's epithelial cells. This is skin. This is stratified squamous epithelium. And you might notice this looks familiar from the histology lecture. This first layer is the epidermis, and it's composed of epithelial tissue. And specifically, it's the stratified squamous epithelial tissue. All that's the epidermis. Below the epidermis is a larger section called the dermis, and that includes this area all the way from the bottom portion of the epidermis all the way down to the subcutaneous fat. This is all dermis. The dermis has a lot of structures in it, like the root, these different nerve fibers. We'll talk about each of these structures here in just a minute. First, look at the dermis is divided into two layers. There's a papillary layer and a reticular layer. The papillary layer is a very small, thin layer just right next to the epidermis. But the majority of the dermis is made up by this reticular layer. And notice some of the structures in the dermis. First of all, the hair. Hair shaft is the part of the hair that sticks above the skin. The hair root is the part of the hair that's below the skin. So all this would be part of the hair root. Here's a cross section of the hair root here. This is the root, the part that's below the skin. The hair follicle is actually this enlarged bulbous portion here. Hair follicle is where the hair cells grow and produce new hair and have elongation of the hair. So this is actually the hair follicle here, and it's part of the hair root. Notice the hypodermis is here below the dermis. Hypodermis is mainly the subcutaneous fat. And again, this is not considered to be a part of the skin. This is part of the connective tissue underneath the skin. There's nerve structures. Two in particular we're going to look at are sensory nerve fibers, or free sensory nerves. And that's represented just by these yellow nerve lines. These are permeate throughout the skin. The skin is full of nerve fibers so that you can feel pressure, touch, temperature throughout the skin. There's also, this is a nerve component. This is called a lamellar corpuscle or a Pacinian corpuscle. It looks like an onion, rings of an onion. But that senses pressure. That's a pressure sensor. And it's connected to through a nerve. And hair follicle receptors, these are nerves that innervate the hair follicle. So this is why you feel pain when you pluck a hair out. Some of the other structures to look at is the dermal papillae. See, this has a peg-shaped surface on the upper portion of the dermis, and it interlocks with the same peg-shaped structure of the epidermis, and they lock together like Lego blocks. This is a sweat pore. This is a sweat gland here. So this would be an exocrine gland because it has a duct, and it secretes its product to the outside of the surface through a sweat gland. So this sweat gland is an exocrine gland. Remember, exocrine glands are glands that put their secretion in a duct, which goes to the surface of the skin. There's a muscle here called the erector pili muscle, and this purpose of this muscle is when it contracts, it makes the hair stand on end. This is not used much in humans, but certainly dogs and cats make use of this. When they get into a fight and the hair stands up on the back of a dog or cat, that's the result of the erector pili muscle. It contracts, and when it contracts, it makes the hair stand up on its end. In humans, we can feel that when we feel like if you feel goosebumps, or you feel like the hair standing on the back of your neck when you're in a stressful situation. That's the result of this erector pili muscle. Again, here's the hair root and the hair follicle. Hair follicle is a part of the hair root. Hair root is what's below the skin. Hair follicle is this bulbous portion. There's adipose tissue down here, represented by the yellow cells. Cutaneous plexus is basically just cutaneous means skin. Plexus refers to the plexus of blood vessels, veins, and arteries. So those are the major structures of the skin. Let's look at the epidermis now in particular. The epidermis has different layers and different cell types, different components of the epidermis, and we'll look at these components of the epidermis. There's 4 cell types in the epidermis. The first type we'll mention is the keratinocytes. These are the basic skin cells. This is represented on the diagram here. That's the majority of the cells in the epidermis are keratinocytes. They produce keratin. Keratin is a protein that gives the skin its protective properties. It makes it waterproof, makes it fit tightly so that it resists invasion by microorganisms, bacteria, fungus, and other pathogens. The majority of the cells in the epidermis are these keratinocytes, and they start here from this basal layer all the way to the surface of the skin. And these keratinocytes are born here at this lower level, the basal layer, and over the lifetime of the cell, they migrate outward towards the apex of the skin, apex of the epithelium. The further away they get from the blood vessels here, the more dead the skin cells become. They get less and less nutrition because the nutrition is all from diffusion. Remember that the epithelial tissue is not vascular, it's avascular. So there's no blood vessels running through the epithelial tissue, so it has to get its nutrients through diffusion. So the further away it is from the nerve, the further away it is from the blood supply, the less nutrients it gets. So that's the keratinocytes. Second type of cell to look at is the dendritic cell, or Langerhans cell. This is a macrophage that's basically part of the immune system. The name macrophage, macro means big, and phage means eat. So it's a big eater. And so this engulfs bacteria and fungus cells, different foreign pathogen cells, or dead skin cells. This engulfs and gets rid of intruders to the skin. These are part of the immune system. These are dendritic or Langerhans cells. Third type of cell is the tactile cells or Merkel cells. Here's a cartoon diagram of Merkel cell here. These are sensory touch receptors. So these cells are connected to a nerve, and this allows for feeling and for sensory awareness in the skin. Tactile Merkel cells. Actually, this should be number 4 instead of number 2, but the 4th cell type is the melanocytes. That's represented here. The melanocytes are located in the deepest portion of the epidermis, and these cells produce melanin, which is to protect the nucleus of the keratinocytes from ultraviolet damage. The melanocytes is what ultimately gives you a suntan. It results in darkening of the skin when exposed to ultraviolet sunlight. But the melanin is protective. It protects the nucleus from UV damage, so it minimizes the risk of metaplasia of the cells and and the onset of cancerous cells. Now, the epidermis is made up of 4 or 5 layers of distinct layers, and we're going to talk about those layers. First, let me make a distinction between thick skin and thin skin. Thick skin basically has all 5 layers of the skin, and it's found only in the hands, the palms of the hand, and the soles of the feet. Again, where the skin is the thickest. The thin skin is basically the skin throughout the rest of the body, and the thin skin only has the 4 other layers, all the layers except for the stratum lucidum. That's only in the thick skin. So the 5 layers are stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and the stratum basale. This diagram shows them in order. Stratum corneum is the outermost layer, the stratum lucidum. Next to that, stratum granulosum. Next to that, stratum spinosum. And the deepest layer is stratum basale. You'll need to know these layers in order. And I have a mnemonic to help you with that I'll show you in just a minute. That basically shows the same thing. It shows the different. These are the 4. This would be in thin skin. Shows the 4 layers of thin skin: stratum corneum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basale. You can read on your own the description of these layers. But a mnemonic to help remember that is the mnemonic "Come, let's get sunburned." And the C in "come" represents corneum, the L in "let's" represents lucidum, G in "get" represents granulosum, sun, S in sun represents spinosum, and burn, basale. So the first letters of this "come, let's get sunburned" gives you the layers of the epidermis from the outside layer to the inside layer. So if I ask you a question about a splinter is stuck in the skin, what layers of the epidermis does the splinter go through in order? You'd need to say corneum, lucidum, the stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and the stratum basale. We'll look at these layers. This is what's unique about them. The stratum basale is the basal layer. It's the deepest of all the epidermal layers, or it's called the base layer. This layer is attached firmly to the dermis. Here's the dermis here. So this is the stratum basale is attached to the dermis, and it serves as an anchor for the epithelial tissues. It has a single row of stem cells that divide. This is where the keratinocytes are born, basically on this stratum basale level. They're born here on this bottom layer, and they come from stem cells which divide by mitosis, producing 2 daughter cells. One daughter cell takes the journey from the basal layer all the way up to the surface. The other daughter cell remains as a stem cell for reproduction later on. But as the cells migrate towards the surface, they become less viable. They get further and further away from their blood supply, and so they start to dehydrate, start to lose some of the cytoplasm, and they get prickly, they get pointed, and they get dehydrated. And basically they die as they go out towards the surface. By the time they get to the stratum corneum, basically the skin cells are just dead husk of cells. They're only just composed of cell membrane, and they're packed tightly, so they make a waterproof barrier, and a barrier that makes it hard for pathogens to invade the skin. So the basal layer is where the keratinocytes are formed. The basal layer is also where the melanocytes are located. Here are the melanocytes here. And the Merkel cells also located in this layer too. Next is the stratum spinosum, or prickly layer. Stratum spinosum is probably the largest layer, and the cells are starting to get dehydrated and start to get prickly. They're starting to lose some of the water in the cells. Start to develop spikes. That's why they're called prickle cells or prickly layer. This layer is several layers of skin cells thick. Above that is stratum granulosum. See that here, and stratum granulosum, because by this time the cells are are small enough and have died so much that you actually see layers, you see granules inside the cells, those specks in cells. That's why it's called stratum granulosum, because of the granules that are seen. By the time the cells reach this stage, they're dead, and they're continue to stay dead as they migrate towards the surface. Stratum lucidum is this clear layer, and this is found only in the thick skin of the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. It's actually a thin, translucent band of clear, flat, dead keratinocytes. It's only seen in thick skin. The final uppermost layer is the stratum corneum, or the horny layer. This has 20 to 30 rows of flat, dead keratin cells. Anucleated means there's no nucleus in these cells. Although these cells are dead, they still function to protect deeper cells from environment. They prevent water loss, protect from abrasion and penetration, and act as a barrier against biological assaults and microorganisms. Now, there was 5 layers to the epidermis. The dermis only has 2 layers, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. We saw that on the picture of the epidermal, the picture of the skin earlier. The papillary layer is the uppermost layer of the dermis, and the reticular layer is the larger of the 2 layers. The papillary layer is made of areolar connective tissue. Remember, this is a loose connective tissue. It has collagen in it, elastic fibers, and blood vessels that go through this layer. The loose fibers allow for phagocytites, like macrophages, to patrol for microorganisms. Dermal papillae are located in this area. These are the superficial region of the dermis that send these finger-like projections up to the epidermis. This is what gives that Lego appearance to the interlock with the epidermis. In thick skin, the dermal papillae lie on top of dermal ridges, which give rise to epidermal ridges. This is what leads to the formation of fingerprints. These ridges are combined to form the fingerprints. Now, the reticular layer is approximately 80% of the dermal layer is made of this reticular layer. And as opposed to the papillary layer, the reticular layer is made of dense, irregular connective tissue. Remember, the papillary layer was made of areolar tissue. The reticular layer is made of dense, irregular connective tissue. It has collagen fibers in there for strength, resiliency. It has a cutaneous network, a network of blood vessels. Remember, this is the dermis, so this is not avascular, this is vascular. So there's blood vessels in this area. Flexure lines in the reticular layer are at folds near the joints or near places of movement of the hand and fingers. See the flexure lines of the digits and flexure lines of the hands on the palm. This is from repetitive movement. It basically creates a crease in the skin. And that's the result of flexure lines. Now, just to illustrate the nature that the skin cells are born in the basal layer and they migrate outward, I asked the question, how deep would you need to put the needle to get a tattoo in the skin that stays permanently? If you go too superficial, the ink's going to slough off as the skin sloughs off, and it won't stay permanent. If you go too deep, you won't be able to see the tattoo as well. So this is for a tattoo. The needle has to go below the epidermis, but in the papillary layer of the dermis. The reason for this is if it's below the epidermis, it's not going to be affected by the migration of the cells toward the surface. If this needle stopped here somewhere in the epidermis, then as those skin cells move towards the surface, it's going to take the ink that's deposited there along with it, and so eventually the ink would slough off and the tattoo would disappear. If the tattoo ink goes deeper, it's going to look blurry. It's not going to look as sharp. It's going to be harder to see, and it won't last as long a time with being crisp and sharp. So the ideal place for the needle depth would be in the dermis, and the papillary layer of the dermis. So then, after you get a tattoo, all you need to do is make sure your spelling is correct, so you don't regret nothing. There's some pigments that contribute to skin color. One of those pigments is melanin. Melanin is the only pigment made in the skin. This is produced by the melanocytes, packaged into melanosomes that are sent to the keratinocytes to protect the DNA of the keratinocytes from sunlight, mainly from UV radiation. Sun exposure stimulates the melanin production. There's two forms of melanin. There's yellow, reddish yellow, and brownish black. All humans have the same number of keratinocytes, but the color differences are due to the amount and form of melanin. Freckles and moles are basically accumulation of melanin in local focal areas. Keratin is a pigment that contributes to skin color. It circulates in the tissues. It's not necessarily unique to the skin itself, but it does result in discoloration of the skin. It's a yellow to orange pigment. It's most obviously seen in palms of the hand and soles of the feet. Hemoglobin is another pigment. Hemoglobin is actually found in the blood, and it gives the blood its red color when it's combined with oxygen. So if there's lower levels of melanin, and such that the redness of the blood below the skin can be seen through the keratinocytes, it gives a pinkish or a reddish coloration. So those are the three skin pigments that result in changes in skin color. That's the end of this first lecture on the integumentary system.